Numbers 1247 were clearly visible beside the door frame, matching exactly the address on his driver's license, his mortgage documents, and every piece of mail that had been delivered to this address for the past 3 years. It was 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, the kind of evening when most people were settling into dinner routines, homework supervision, and the comfortable rhythm of suburban life. But for Jerome, this evening had just become something else entirely. Something that would test every lesson he'd learned about patience, about dignity, and about the careful balance between authority and justice. "I live here," Jerome said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is my house." His tone carried no anger, no defensiveness, just the quiet confidence of a man stating an indisputable fact. Officer Kyle Morrison stepped out of the passenger side of the patrol car, his boots echoing against the asphalt. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the suburban quiet. "Sure you do," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. His radio crackled with static, distant voices discussing traffic stops and welfare checks in other parts of the city. The call had come in 20 minutes earlier. Suspicious individual attempting to break into residence at 1247 Maple Grove Drive. The caller, a neighbor who preferred to remain anonymous, had described a tall black male in a dark suit, acting suspiciously near the front door. The description was vague, the concern was immediate, and the response was swift. What the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known from the dispatch call, was that Jerome Washington had just concluded the most important day of his professional life. 6 hours earlier, he had sat in the mayor's office, surrounded by city council members, police union representatives, and community leaders, as he was officially sworn in as Detroit's newest police chief. The ceremony had been small, deliberate, and historic. Jerome was only the third African American to hold the position in the city's history, and at 42, he was also one of the youngest. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Here he stood, the city's top law enforcement official, being treated like a criminal on his own property by officers who would report to him starting Monday morning. "Ma'am, we received a call about a break-in attempt," Brad said, addressing his words to someone behind Jerome. The door had opened silently during their exchange, and Jerome's wife, Ebony, had stepped onto the porch. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and growing alarm as she took in the scene. 2 white officers, lights flashing, her husband standing rigid between them and their home. Ebony Washington was a pediatric nurse at Detroit Medical Center, accustomed to crisis situations, trained to remain calm under pressure. But this was different. This was personal. This was her husband, her home, her family being questioned and challenged in a way that felt both familiar and infuriating. "There's no break-in," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. "This is my husband, Jerome Washington. He lives here. We both do." She held up her own keys, the metal catching the harsh glare of the patrol car's lights. Kyle's expression hardened. "We'll need to see some identification," he said, directing his demand toward Jerome. "Both of you. And we'll need to verify your story with the homeowner." "I am the homeowner," Jerome replied, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. His movements were deliberate, visible, careful. He'd had this conversation before, in different contexts, at different times in his life. The dance was always the same. Prove you belong. Justify your presence. Validate your existence in spaces that others took for granted. He handed over his driver's license, his movements smooth and unthreatening. The plastic card contained his photograph, his name, and his address. 1247 Maple Grove Drive, Detroit, MI 48207. The same address where they currently stood, where the officers had responded to a call about a suspicious person. Brad examined the license with theatrical thoroughness, holding it up to the streetlight, comparing the photo to Jerome's face, checking the address against the house numbers. His partner Kyle had moved closer, positioning himself at an angle that would give him a clear view of Jerome's hands while maintaining a tactical advantage. The house itself stood as silent testimony to the Washington family's presence. The lawn was meticulously maintained, the hedges trimmed, the driveway clear except for Jerome's black sedan and Ebony's red SUV. A child's bicycle leaned against the garage door, and a basketball hoop was mounted above it. Wind chimes hung from the porch ceiling, creating a gentle melody that seemed incongruous with the tension of the moment. "This could be fake," Kyle said, though his tone suggested he knew better. The license looked authentic, the address matched, and the man standing before them clearly belonged in this neighborhood. But something about the situation demanded that they push further, question more deeply, require additional proof of belonging. "I have my mortgage papers inside," Jerome offered. His tone remained even, professional. 23 years on the force, first as a patrol officer, then detective, then sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and now chief, had taught him the value of patience. He understood the psychology of confrontation, knew when to stand firm and when to provide the path of least resistance. But he also understood something else. This moment wasn't really about identification or home ownership or suspicious activity. This was about assumptions, about who belonged where, about the invisible lines that divided communities even when those communities shared the same zip codes. "We'll need to check this out," Brad said, stepping back toward the patrol car with Jerome's license in hand. He keyed his radio and began speaking in the clipped, coded language of police communication. The static responses were barely audible to Jerome and Ebony, but the intent was clear. Verification, background checks, confirmation of identity. While they waited, Kyle kept his attention focused on the couple. "You been living here long?" he asked, though his tone suggested casual conversation rather than genuine interest. 3 years, Ebony answered. "We moved here after Jerome's promotion to captain." She emphasized the word captain slightly, a subtle indication that her husband was law enforcement. Sometimes that information changed things, created a bridge of professional understanding that could diffuse tension. Kyle's expression didn't change. "Captain of what?" "Detroit Police Department," Jerome said quietly. He hadn't wanted to reveal his profession, hadn't wanted to use his badge as a shield or a weapon. But the conversation had reached a point where context might matter, where professional courtesy might create space for de-escalation. The effect was immediate, but not what Jerome had expected. Kyle's eyes narrowed. His posture became more rigid. "You're a cop," he said, the words carrying a mixture of skepticism and something else. Something that sounded almost like disdain. 23 years, Jerome confirmed. Brad returned from the patrol car, Jerome's license still in his hand. The radio conversation had concluded, the verification complete. The license was legitimate, the address confirmed, the identity established. But instead of relief, there was something else in Brad's expression. Something that suggested this revelation had complicated rather than simplified the situation. "Funny thing," Brad said, his tone casual but his eyes hard. "We ran your name through the system. Seems you've got quite a record of complaints, excessive force, failure to follow protocol, community relations issues." The accusations hung in the air like smoke, toxic and obscuring. Jerome felt Ebony's sharp intake of breath beside him, felt the weight of her eyes as she turned to look at him. These weren't random accusations. They were specific, detailed, and designed to undermine his credibility in this moment. But Jerome knew something that these officers didn't. He knew that every complaint they were referencing had been investigated, reviewed, and dismissed. He knew that his record was not only clean, but exemplary. And he knew that the database they were accessing would show not just complaints, but also commendations, promotions, and a distinguished career in service to the city of Detroit. More importantly, he knew that, as of this morning, his position in the department hierarchy had changed fundamentally. The man they were attempting to intimidate was now their ultimate supervisor, their chief, their boss. But he also knew that this wasn't the moment for revelation. This was a moment that required careful navigation, strategic thinking, and an understanding of how power dynamics could shift in an instant. "Those complaints were investigated and dismissed," Jerome said simply. His tone carried no defensiveness, no anger, just fact. Kyle snorted. "That's what they all say." The words stung more than they should have. Jerome had spent his entire career building relationships across racial lines, working to bridge divides between law enforcement and the communities they served. He had been mentored by white officers, had mentored officers of all races, had believed that professional competence and personal character could transcend the ugly divisions that plagued society. Tonight was teaching him a different lesson. "Look," Brad said, stepping closer. His tone shifted to something that might have been mistaken for reasonableness, if not for the edge beneath it. "We got a call about suspicious activity. We're just doing our job. But this whole situation, the complaints, the attitude, it's not adding up right." "What attitude?" Ebony asked, her voice sharp for the first time. Her husband had been polite, cooperative, and respectful throughout the entire interaction. He had provided identification, answered questions, and offered additional verification. If there was an attitude problem, it wasn't coming from their side of the conversation. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to stay out of this," Kyle said, his hand moving closer to his utility belt. "This is between us and your husband." "It's between you and both of us," Ebony replied firmly. "This is our house, our property, our family. You don't get to exclude me from a conversation happening on my own front porch." The tension ratcheted higher. Jerome could feel the situation slipping toward a precipice, could sense the multiple ways this confrontation could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. In his years of police work, he had been on the other side of situations like this, had seen how quickly misunderstanding could become conflict, how rapidly conflict could become tragedy. "Officers," Jerome said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Let's take a step back. You've verified my identity. You've confirmed my address. The call you received was mistaken. There's no crime here, no violation, no cause for further action." Brad and Kyle exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. Jerome recognized the expression, had seen it countless times during his career. It was the look of officers deciding how far to push, how much they could get away with, whether to de-escalate or double down. The choice they made would define not just this moment, but potentially their careers, their futures, and their understanding of justice itself. "We're not done here," Brad said finally. "Something about this whole situation doesn't sit right. I think we need to take a closer look." Jerome felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. The words carried an implicit threat, a promise of escalation that could transform this neighborhood confrontation into something much more serious. He thought about his children, asleep upstairs, unaware that their father was being treated like a suspect on their own front porch. He thought about his new position, the responsibilities that would begin on Monday morning, the trust that had been placed in him by the mayor and the community. He thought about the years he had spent building bridges, fostering understanding, working toward a vision of law enforcement that served and protected everyone equally. And he made a decision that would change everything. "All right, officers," he said, his voice carrying a new quality that neither Brad nor Kyle immediately recognized. "You want to take a closer look. Let's do exactly that." 6 hours earlier, the mahogany-paneled conference room in Detroit City Hall had buzzed with quiet conversation and the rustle of papers. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished table where 11 people sat in careful arrangement. The air carried the scent of fresh coffee and the weight of history about to be made. Mayor Stephen Bradley sat at the head of the table, his gray suit impeccable, his expression serious but pleased. To his right, City Council President Rebecca Martinez shuffled through a stack of documents, occasionally making notes in the margins with a gold pen. Across from her, Police Union Representative Todd Kellerman reviewed his own paperwork, his jaw set in the expression of a man who had fought hard for this moment. At the far end of the table, Jerome Washington sat with his hands folded, wearing his dress uniform for what he knew would be the last time in its current configuration. The next time he put on a uniform, it would bear the insignia of Chief of Police, a position he had worked toward for over 2 decades. The swearing-in ceremony had been deliberately small. After months of community meetings, background investigations, and political negotiations, the decision to appoint Jerome as police chief had been contentious enough without making the actual appointment a public spectacle. Too many voices had argued against his selection, too many interests had pushed for other candidates, too many fears had been expressed about his vision for reform. But here he was, about to take an oath that would make him the 3rd African-American police chief in Detroit's history, and the first in over a decade. "Before we begin the formal ceremony," Mayor Bradley said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 8 years in office, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge the significance of this appointment. Jerome Washington represents not just exceptional qualifications and outstanding service, but also a commitment to the kind of reform and community engagement that our city desperately needs." The words carried weight beyond their formal meaning. Detroit had been through cycles of police scandal, community unrest, and reform efforts that had promised much and delivered little. The appointment of a new chief was always politically significant, but this appointment came at a moment when the relationship between law enforcement and the community had reached a breaking point. 3 months earlier, a controversial officer-involved incident in the city's east side had sparked weeks of protests. A young black man named Tyrone Fletcher had been stopped for a traffic violation that escalated into a physical confrontation, resulting in serious injuries and allegations of excessive force. The incident had been captured on cell phone video, shared across social media, and become a rallying point for activists demanding systematic change. The officers involved had been cleared by internal investigation, but the community response had been swift and angry. Town halls had been packed with residents demanding accountability. Pastors had organized prayer vigils that became political rallies. City council meetings had been disrupted by protesters carrying signs reading, "No justice, no peace, and reform now." In that environment, the selection of a new police chief had become less about administrative transition and more about symbolic statement. The community demanded someone who understood their concerns, who had experienced the realities of policing from both sides, who could bridge the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Jerome Washington's background made him an ideal candidate for that bridge-building role, but also a controversial one. Growing up in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, Jerome had experienced the city's police force from the perspective of a young black man long before he considered joining it. He remembered being stopped and questioned for walking home from school. He remembered watching his older brother Isaiah get handcuffed during a traffic stop that resulted in no charges but plenty of humiliation. He remembered the mixture of fear and resentment that seemed to define the relationship between police and community in his world. But he also remembered Officer Dennis Murphy, an Irish cop who had walked the Corktown beat for 15 years and knew every kid by name. Murphy had been the one to suggest that Jerome consider law enforcement as a career, had been the one to explain that change came from within, had been the one to sponsor his application to the police academy. That dual perspective, community member and law enforcement professional, had shaped every day of Jerome's career. As a patrol officer, he had worked to build relationships rather than just write tickets. As a detective, he had focused on cases that mattered to neighborhoods, not just statistics that mattered to headquarters. As a sergeant and lieutenant, he had mentored young officers to see community members as partners rather than problems. His personnel file reflected that approach: commendations for community engagement, awards for innovative problem solving, recognition for mentorship and leadership, but also the inevitable complaints that came with any active police career, especially for an officer who wasn't afraid to challenge colleagues when their behavior crossed lines. Those complaints had been weaponized during the selection process. Anonymous flyers had been distributed in several neighborhoods, listing every allegation ever made against Jerome, regardless of outcome. Radio talk shows had debated his fitness for leadership. Social media had buzzed with debates about whether he was too soft, too hard, too compromised, or too reform-minded. But Jerome had survived the scrutiny, had answered every question, had addressed every concern. And now, in this conference room, he was about to take an oath that would give him the authority to reshape the department he had served for 23 years. Council President Martinez cleared her throat. "Chief Washington," she said, the title still new and formal, "before we proceed with the ceremony, I want to address some of the concerns that have been raised during the selection process." Jerome nodded. He had expected this moment, had prepared for it. "There have been questions about your approach to discipline," she continued. "Some community members worry that your background as a long-time officer will make you reluctant to hold colleagues accountable. Others in law enforcement worry that your reform agenda will undermine morale and effectiveness. How do you respond to those concerns?" Jerome stood, his tall frame commanding attention, even in the formal setting. The question struck at the heart of the impossible balance he would need to maintain as chief. Too much reform too fast, and he would lose the support of officers whose cooperation he needed to implement change. Too little reform too slowly, and he would lose the trust of communities whose support was essential for effective policing. "Council President Martinez," he began, his voice steady and thoughtful, "I understand both concerns because I've lived both realities. I've been the officer making difficult decisions in dangerous situations, and I've been the community member wondering whether those decisions were fair and justified." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The people in this room represented different constituencies with different expectations, and his response would be analyzed and interpreted by both supporters and critics. "Accountability and effectiveness aren't opposites," he continued. "They're partners. Good officers want to work in a department where bad officers are held accountable because bad officers make everyone less safe and less effective. Community members want to trust law enforcement because trust makes it easier to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, and work together to solve problems." Union Representative Kellerman leaned forward. "That sounds good in theory, Chief, but what does it look like in practice? Are you going to second-guess every use of force decision? Are you going to throw officers under the bus every time someone complains?" Jerome met his gaze directly. "Todd, you know my record. 23 years, multiple commendations, 0 sustained complaints for excessive force or misconduct. I didn't get here by throwing anyone under buses. I got here by holding everyone, including myself, to high standards." The exchange reflected the delicate politics of police leadership. Jerome needed the support of the rank-and-file officers who would implement his policies and respond to his directives. But he also needed the trust of a community that had grown skeptical of law enforcement promises and commitments. Mayor Bradley intervened smoothly. "I think we can save the policy discussions for the transition meetings," he said with a diplomat's smile. "Today is about ceremony and commitment. Chief Washington, are you ready to take the oath of office?" Jerome straightened his shoulders and placed his right hand on a leather-bound Bible that his wife Ebony held steady. The words of the oath were traditional, unchanged for decades, but their meaning felt fresh and weighty in this moment. "I, Jerome Washington, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of Chief of Police of the City of Detroit, that I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Michigan, and that I will enforce the laws of the state and the city without favor or prejudice." The words echoed in the conference room, binding him to principles that were both ancient and urgent. As he spoke, Jerome thought about the officers who would soon report to him, the communities he would serve, the challenges that awaited him starting Monday morning. But he also thought about simpler things: his daughter Shanice's school play next week, which he had promised to attend, his son Clarence's basketball game on Saturday, where Jerome served as a volunteer assistant coach, the quiet evening routine he shared with Ebony, talking through their days over dinner, planning weekend activities, maintaining the normal rhythms of family life. Those personal moments mattered because they kept him grounded in the reality that police work was ultimately about protecting the ordinary, precious routines that made life meaningful. The ceremonies and titles and authorities were important, but they served a deeper purpose, ensuring that families could feel safe in their homes, children could walk to school without fear, and communities could thrive. "Congratulations, Chief Washington," Mayor Bradley said, extending his hand. Jerome shook it firmly, aware that cameras were recording the moment for posterity, for news broadcasts, for history books that might someday record this day as significant. But history would be made by actions, not ceremonies. History would be shaped by the decisions Jerome made in the weeks and months ahead, by the policies he implemented, by the culture he fostered, by the trust he built or failed to build. The meeting continued for another hour, covering transition logistics, budget discussions, and scheduling details. Jerome would officially begin his duties on Monday, but he would spend the rest of the week in briefings with department heads, community leaders, and city officials. There would be meetings with union representatives, sessions with civil rights groups, conferences with business leaders and neighborhood organizations. All of that preparation and ceremony felt distant now, as Jerome stood on his own front porch being challenged by two officers who had no idea they were confronting their new boss. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Here he was, having just sworn an oath to enforce laws without favor or prejudice, being treated with exactly the kind of bias and presumption that he had committed to eliminate. But the irony was also instructive. This moment was a perfect example of why his appointment mattered, why reform was necessary, why the relationship between police and community needed fundamental change. Officers Brad Kingston and Kyle Morrison represented a mindset that Jerome understood intimately because he had seen it throughout his career. They were good officers in many ways, probably effective at their jobs, probably well regarded by their peers, but they carried assumptions and biases that shaped their interactions with community members, that influenced their judgment calls, that created exactly the kind of mistrust and resentment that plagued police-community relations. Standing on his porch, being questioned and challenged and implicitly threatened, Jerome was experiencing firsthand the reality that thousands of Detroit residents faced regularly. The difference was that he had the power to do something about it, starting Monday morning. The question was how to handle this immediate situation in a way that was both just and constructive, both firm and educational. Jerome looked at the two officers, saw their rigid postures and suspicious expressions, and made a decision that would test everything he believed about leadership, justice, and the possibility of change. "We need you to come down to the precinct for additional questioning," Brad said, his tone shifting from suspicious to authoritative. His radio crackled with dispatch chatter, the electronic voices creating a soundtrack of urban law enforcement that Jerome knew intimately from the other side. "Additional questioning about what?" Ebony asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. She stepped closer to her husband, creating a united front on their own front porch. The porch light cast harsh shadows across their faces, making the scene feel more dramatic than the suburban setting should have allowed. Kyle moved his hand closer to his handcuffs. "Ma'am, I need you to step back inside. This is official police business now." "This is harassment," Ebony replied, her nursing background giving her the confidence to stand up to authority when she saw injustice. "You've seen his identification. You've verified his address. There's no crime here except the one you're creating." Jerome placed a gentle hand on his wife's arm. "Ebony, go inside. Check on the kids." This was his way of protecting his family from whatever was about to unfold, but also his way of accepting responsibility for defusing a situation that had spiraled beyond reason. "I'm not leaving you out here with them," she said firmly. "If they want to arrest you for existing in your own home, they can arrest me too." The solidarity was touching, but Jerome understood tactical situations better than his wife did. He could see the way Kyle's posture had changed, could hear the shift in Brad's voice, could feel the momentum building toward confrontation. Someone needed to be inside the house, available to call lawyers, to protect their children, to serve as witness if things went badly wrong. "Please," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with a look that communicated volumes. "Trust me on this." Reluctantly, Ebony stepped toward the door, but before going inside, she turned back to the officers. "I want your names and badge numbers," she said. "I want to know exactly who I'm filing complaints against." "Badge 4127, Brad said with a smirk. "Officer Brad Kingston, Precinct 15. Happy to help." "Badge 3891, Kyle added. "Officer Kyle Morrison, same precinct. And lady, you can file all the complaints you want. Won't change the facts of this situation." Ebony memorized the information, took one last look at her husband, and disappeared into the house. Jerome could hear her footsteps on the hardwood floor, could imagine her checking on 8-year-old Clarence and 11-year-old Shanice, could picture her reaching for her phone to call family, friends, lawyers, anyone who might help navigate this nightmare. "Now it's just us," Kyle said, stepping closer to Jerome. "And I think it's time for some straight talk." "I've been talking straight this entire time," Jerome replied. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface now. 23 years of police work had taught him when situations were moving past the point of reasonable resolution. "See, that's the problem," Brad said, pulling out a small notebook. He flipped it open and began reading from pages covered with handwritten notes. "Jerome Washington, age 42, Detroit Police Department captain. Multiple complaints for excessive force, failure to follow protocol, and what's listed here as attitude problems with fellow officers. Every one of those complaints was investigated and dismissed," Jerome said evenly. "And if you're reading from official records, you know that." Kyle laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Investigated by who? Other cops? You think that means anything?" The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Police internal affairs investigations were often criticized as inadequate, biased toward officers, reluctant to find fault with colleagues. Jerome had seen cases where legitimate complaints were dismissed or minimized, where officers with problematic patterns were protected rather than corrected. But his own record was clean for reasons that had nothing to do with institutional bias. He had never used excessive force because he had learned early in his career that intelligence and communication were more effective than intimidation and violence. He had never failed to follow protocol because he understood that rules existed to protect both officers and citizens. And his relationships with fellow officers were complicated precisely because he held everyone, including himself, to high standards. The complaints against him had come mostly from officers who resented his promotion record, who felt that his community engagement work was criticism of their more traditional approaches, who saw his reform advocacy as betrayal of police solidarity. None of the complaints had involved citizen allegations of misconduct. But standing on his porch, being questioned by officers who had clearly researched his background, Jerome realized that the truth was less important than the narrative. Brad and Kyle had decided he was a problem officer, a troublemaker, someone who deserved whatever treatment they were planning to deliver. "Here's what I think happened," Brad said, closing the notebook and stepping closer. "I think you and your wife are running some kind of scam. I think you're squatting in this house using fake identification, and when we showed up, you decided to play the cop card to get out of trouble." "That's completely ridiculous," Jerome said, his patience beginning to fray. "You have my driver's license, which shows this address. You can verify home ownership through public records. You can call the department and confirm my employment and rank." Kyle shook his head. "Public records can be faked. Department records can be manipulated. And frankly, you don't look like any police captain I know." The words hung in the air like poison gas, toxic and unmistakable in their meaning. Jerome felt a familiar mixture of rage and resignation, the emotional cocktail that came with confronting racism that was both obvious and deniable. "What exactly does a police captain look like?" Jerome asked quietly. Brad and Kyle exchanged a glance, some silent communication that Jerome recognized from his own years of police work. It was the look of officers deciding how far to push, how explicit to make their biases, how much they could get away with in the shadows of plausible deniability. Professional, Kyle said finally. Experienced, trustworthy. The code words were familiar to Jerome from years of hearing them used to exclude, to diminish, to other. Professional meant conforming to white middle-class behavioral norms. Experienced meant having the right kind of background and connections. Trustworthy meant belonging to the club of people who looked and thought and acted in acceptable ways. "I've been professional for 23 years, Jerome said. "I've earned my experience through decades of service, and my trustworthiness is reflected in my promotion record and my standing in the community." "Standing in the community," Brad repeated with a laugh. "That's rich. You know what your community says about you behind your back?" Jerome's jaw tightened. "What community would that be?" "The real community," Kyle said. "The officers who actually do the work while you're off playing politics and giving speeches about police reform." The accusation revealed something important about how Jerome was perceived within certain segments of the department. His community engagement work, his advocacy for policy changes, his efforts to bridge divides between law enforcement and neighborhoods had made him enemies among officers who saw those activities as betrayal rather than leadership. But it also revealed something about Brad and Kyle specifically. They had done their homework, had researched his background, had come to this confrontation with preformed opinions and predetermined conclusions. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or misunderstanding. This was targeted harassment based on who Jerome was and what he represented. "You know what I think," Brad said, stepping close enough that Jerome could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "I think you're exactly the kind of cop who makes the job harder for everyone else. I think you're the kind of guy who talks about community relations while real officers are out there getting shot at." Jerome's hands clenched involuntarily. The accusation struck at his core identity as a police officer, questioned his courage and commitment, suggested that his approach to law enforcement was somehow less valid than more traditional methods. But more than that, it revealed the depth of the divide within the department itself. Jerome had known that his reform advocacy made some colleagues uncomfortable, but he hadn't fully understood how that discomfort had hardened into resentment and hostility. "I've been shot at," Jerome said quietly. "I've been stabbed, spit on, threatened, and attacked. I've worked undercover, walked violent beats, and arrested murderers. Don't question my courage or commitment." Kyle smirked. "Tough guy now? Where was all that toughness when you were filing complaints against fellow officers?" Another accusation, another revelation. Jerome had indeed filed formal complaints against colleagues during his career, but only in cases of clear misconduct that threatened public safety or department integrity. A partner who drank on duty, a sergeant who falsified overtime records, a detective who planted evidence. Each complaint had been carefully considered, thoroughly documented, and properly filed through official channels. Each had resulted in appropriate disciplinary action, and each had made Jerome enemies among officers who valued loyalty over accountability. Standing on his porch, Jerome realized that his entire career was being weaponized against him by officers who saw his integrity as betrayal and his leadership as threat. "You want to know what I think?" Brad continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I think you're a fraud. I think you're a race-baiting troublemaker who's been playing games with the system for years. And I think tonight is the night your games catch up with you." The threat was unmistakable now, no longer hidden behind procedural language or professional courtesy. Jerome felt the familiar hypervigilance that came with danger, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through 2 decades of police work. But this danger was different. It wasn't coming from criminals or suspects or hostile crowds. It was coming from fellow officers, from colleagues, from people who had sworn the same oath he had sworn and carried the same badge he carried. "Officers," Jerome said, his voice taking on a tone that Kyle and Brad didn't recognize, one that carried authority earned through years of command experience. "You are about to make a mistake that will define the rest of your careers." "Oh yeah?" Kyle said, unimpressed. "What mistake is that?" "You're about to arrest your new boss," Jerome said quietly. The words dropped into the evening air like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this suburban street, this moment, this confrontation between men who should have been on the same side. But the impact wasn't immediate. Brad and Kyle stared at Jerome for a moment, processing the claim, deciding whether to take it seriously or dismiss it as desperate bluffing. "Your new boss," Kyle repeated slowly. "Right, and I'm the mayor." "Monday morning," Jerome continued, his voice steady and certain. "You'll report for duty at Precinct 15, and sometime during that shift you'll attend a mandatory meeting where you'll be introduced to the new police chief. That would be me." The silence stretched for long seconds. Jerome could see the calculation happening in both officers' minds, the weighing of possibilities, the assessment of risk and credibility. "Prove it," Brad said finally. Jerome reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and visible. He withdrew his smartphone and scrolled to a specific contact, a number he had programmed just hours earlier. "Mayor Bradley," he said when the call connected. "It's Jerome. I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I have a situation that requires your immediate attention." The conversation was brief, professional, and decisive. "Yes, sir," Jerome said into the phone, his eyes never leaving the two officers. "I understand this is highly irregular, but the situation requires immediate clarification." He ended the call and looked at Brad and Kyle, who had watched the exchange with growing uncertainty. "The mayor is going to call your precinct commander directly," Jerome said. "Within the next 5 minutes, you'll receive radio confirmation of my identity and position, and then we're going to have a very different conversation about what happened here tonight." Kyle's radio crackled to life almost immediately. "Unit 1247, return to base immediately for debriefing with Commander Phillips. Priority 1. Brad's expression changed from skepticism to something approaching alarm. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 1247, requesting confirmation of status for Jerome Washington, Detroit PD." The response came through clearly, audible to everyone on the porch. "Jerome Washington, Captain, badge number 1847, newly appointed Chief of Police effective Monday. All units are advised to show appropriate courtesy and respect." The silence that followed was deafening. Kyle's face had gone pale. Brad looked like he had been struck by lightning. Both officers seemed to shrink in their uniforms, the authority they had wielded so confidently moments before evaporating like steam. "Chief Washington," Brad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we had no idea." Jerome studied both men for a long moment. This was the moment that would define not just their careers, but his leadership style, his approach to discipline, and his vision for the department he was about to lead. He could destroy them. With a word, he could end their careers, ruin their reputations, make them examples of what happened to officers who let bias cloud their judgment. He had the authority, the justification, and arguably the responsibility to do exactly that. But he also had the opportunity to do something different, something that might actually change hearts and minds rather than just punish bad behavior. "Officers," Jerome said, his voice carrying the weight of command for the first time that evening, "we have a lot to discuss." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Officer Brad Kingston, who moments before had been threatening arrest and questioning Jerome's right to exist on his own property, now stood at something approaching attention. His earlier swagger replaced by barely concealed panic. Officer Kyle Morrison had gone silent, his radio clutched in a white-knuckled grip, his eyes darting between Jerome and the patrol car as if calculating whether flight was still an option. The suburban street, which had been the stage for confrontation, now felt different. The same porch light cast the same shadows, the same wind chimes played the same gentle melody, but the power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that the very air seemed changed. Jerome Washington looked at the two officers who would report to him in 72 hours and felt the weight of decision. This moment would echo through his tenure as chief, would define his relationship with rank-and-file officers, would establish his credibility as a leader who could bridge the divide between community expectations and law enforcement realities. In his 23 years of police work, Jerome had seen careers destroyed by single moments of poor judgment. He had watched good officers make bad decisions that haunted them forever. He had also seen the cycle of punishment and resentment that created exactly the kind of toxic culture that plagued police departments across the country. Standing on his porch, facing two officers whose bias and assumptions had led them to harass their own chief, Jerome had the opportunity to break that cycle or perpetuate it. "Chief Washington," Brad said again, his voice stronger now but still uncertain. "Sir, if we had known your identity from the beginning, this entire situation would have been handled differently." The statement revealed everything that was wrong with the interaction, everything that Jerome had committed to changing as chief. The problem wasn't that they had failed to recognize his authority. The problem was that they had failed to treat a citizen with basic dignity and respect. "Officer Kingston," Jerome said, stepping down from the porch to stand at eye level with both men. "That statement tells me you understand exactly what went wrong here, even if you don't realize it." Brad's confusion was evident. "Sir, I don't follow." "The issue isn't that you didn't know I was a police officer," Jerome explained, his tone patient but firm. "The issue is that you treated someone you believed to be a civilian with suspicion, disrespect, and hostility based on assumptions about race, class, and belonging." Kyle found his voice. "Chief, we responded to a call about suspicious activity. We were following standard protocol for investigating potential criminal behavior." Jerome pulled out his phone and opened the voice recorder app. "With your permission, officers, I'd like to record the rest of this conversation for training purposes." Both men nodded quickly, though neither looked comfortable with the prospect of having their words preserved for posterity. "Officer Morrison," Jerome continued, "describe the suspicious activity that was reported." Kyle glanced at his notepad. "Caller reported a tall black male in dark clothing acting suspiciously near the front door of 1247 Maple Grove Drive, possibly attempting to break in." "And when you arrived, what did you observe?" "We saw you approaching the front door with keys," Kyle admitted. "Did you see me attempting to break in? Did you see me damaging property? Did you see me acting in any way that would constitute criminal behavior?" "No, sir." "So the suspicious activity was a homeowner unlocking his front door?" Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "In hindsight, yes, sir." Jerome turned to Brad. "Officer Kingston, when I provided identification showing this address, what was your response?" Brad's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Sir, I questioned the validity of your identification." "On what basis?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. Brad couldn't say that he had questioned Jerome's identification because Jerome was black. He couldn't admit that his assumptions about who belonged in this neighborhood had colored his judgment. He couldn't acknowledge that his worldview had made it impossible for him to accept that a black man might legitimately own a house in this area. "Officer Kingston," Jerome pressed gently, "I need you to think carefully about your answer because this conversation is going to be part of a training module for the entire department." "Sir," Brad said finally, "I made assumptions based on my preconceptions about who lives in this neighborhood." The admission was painful but necessary. Jerome could see the recognition dawning in Brad's eyes, the uncomfortable realization that his bias had driven his actions from the moment he stepped out of the patrol car. "And, Officer Morrison," Jerome continued, "when my wife confirmed my identity, what was your response?" Kyle looked down at his boots. "I suggested that the identification might be fake and that we needed to verify your story with the homeowner." "Even though I was standing on the porch of the address listed on my identification?" "Yes, sir." "Even though my wife had corroborated my identity?" "Yes, sir." Jerome paused, letting the weight of their admissions settle. Behind him, he could see the curtains of his front window move slightly. Ebony was watching, listening, probably recording the conversation on her own phone. His children were asleep upstairs, unaware that their father was conducting a master class in leadership and accountability on their front porch. "Officers," Jerome said, his voice taking on a different quality, gentler but more serious. "I want you to understand something. This conversation isn't about punishment. It's about learning. It's about becoming the kind of police officers that our communities need and deserve." Brad looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since the radio confirmation. "But," Jerome continued, "learning requires honesty. It requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our assumptions. It requires committing to do better, not just because you got caught, but because it's right." He gestured toward his house, toward the neighborhood, toward the community beyond. "This is my home, but it's also a symbol of something larger. It represents the American dream, the idea that hard work and dedication can lead to success and security. When you questioned my right to be here, when you assumed I must be a criminal rather than a homeowner, you were attacking that dream not just for me but for everyone who looks like me." Kyle spoke up, his voice small. "Chief, we never meant to attack anything. We were just doing our job." Jerome nodded. "I believe that, Officer Morrison. But intention doesn't negate impact. The effect of your actions was to make me feel like a suspect in my own home, to put my family through trauma, to reinforce exactly the kind of mistrust between police and community that we need to overcome." Both officers were listening intently now, their earlier defensiveness replaced by something approaching understanding. "Here's what's going to happen," Jerome said, his voice taking on the tone of command. "Tomorrow morning, both of you will report to headquarters for additional training on implicit bias, community relations, and de-escalation techniques. You'll participate in ride-alongs with community liaison officers. You'll attend town hall meetings in the neighborhoods you patrol." Brad and Kyle exchanged glances. The assignment was clearly punitive, but it was also educational, an opportunity for growth rather than just punishment. "More importantly," Jerome continued, "you'll both participate in developing new training materials based on tonight's incident. You'll help create scenarios and case studies that will teach other officers how to recognize and overcome the kind of assumptions that led to this confrontation." The beauty of the assignment was its duality. It held both officers accountable for their actions while giving them the opportunity to contribute to solutions. It transformed their mistake into a teaching moment for the entire department. "Sir," Brad said hesitantly, "what about our personnel files? Will this incident be documented as disciplinary action?" Jerome considered the question carefully. Documentation would serve as a warning, a paper trail that could protect the department if either officer engaged in similar behavior in the future. But it would also follow them throughout their careers, potentially limiting promotion opportunities and affecting their relationships with colleagues. "This conversation is being recorded for training purposes," Jerome said finally. "The incident will be documented as a learning opportunity rather than disciplinary action, provided that your future behavior demonstrates genuine growth and understanding." Relief flooded both men's faces. Jerome was offering them something precious in the world of law enforcement, a second chance without permanent consequences, an opportunity to learn from mistakes without having careers destroyed. "But," Jerome added, his tone sharpening, "if either of you engages in similar behavior in the future, tonight's incident will be revisited and all options for disciplinary action will be considered. This is your opportunity to demonstrate that you can be the kind of officers our community needs." "Understood, sir," both men said in unison. Jerome looked at them for a long moment, seeing not just the officers who had harassed him, but the potential for what they could become with proper guidance and commitment to growth. "Officers," he said, stepping back toward his porch, "I want you to think about something as you drive back to the precinct tonight. Every interaction you have with a community member is an opportunity to build trust or destroy it. Every assumption you make about someone's guilt or innocence based on their appearance or address or race is a choice that affects not just that person, but our entire profession." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "You have the power to make people feel safe or threatened, respected or diminished, heard or ignored. That power comes with tremendous responsibility, and I trust that you'll use it wisely from now on." The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. Jerome was establishing his expectations not just for these two officers, but for every officer in the department. He was setting a tone of accountability mixed with opportunity, of consequence paired with growth. "Chief Washington," Kyle said, "may I ask a question?" "Of course." "How do we make sure this doesn't happen again, not just with us, but with other officers?" The question demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking Jerome hoped to foster. Kyle wasn't just concerned about avoiding future problems for himself, but about systemic change that would benefit the entire department and community. "Officer Morrison," Jerome said with the first hint of a smile he had shown all evening, "that's exactly the right question to ask, and finding the answer is going to be the work we do together over the coming months and years." As the two officers walked back toward their patrol car, Jerome called after them, "Officers, one more thing." They turned back, expectant. "Monday morning, when you meet your new chief at the department briefing, I expect you to act as though we're meeting for the first time. Tonight stays between us, but the lessons we've learned tonight become part of how we move forward together." "Yes, sir," they said in unison. "And officers, take some time over the weekend to think about what kind of police department you want to be part of and what kind of officers you want to be. Because starting Monday, we're going to build something better than what we have now." The patrol car pulled away from the curb, its headlights sweeping across manicured lawns as Brad Kingston and Kyle Morrison drove slowly through the neighborhood they had been policing. The silence in the car was heavy, filled with the weight of realization and the uncomfortable process of self-examination. Neither officer spoke for the first several blocks. The radio chatter continued its constant background noise of dispatch calls, unit responses, and routine communications, but both men were lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. Finally, Kyle broke the silence. "Brad, we almost arrested the chief of police." Brad's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Don't you think I know that?" His voice carried a mixture of anger and self-recrimination. 3 weeks before retirement eligibility, and I almost threw it all away because I couldn't see past my own prejudices." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Brad Kingston had 27 years on the force, had planned to finish his career with dignity and a full pension. Tonight had come dangerously close to destroying all of that because he had let assumptions guide his actions. Kyle stared out the passenger window at houses similar to the one where Jerome Washington lived. "How many times do you think we've done this before?" he asked quietly. "Made assumptions about people based on where they were and what they looked like?" Brad considered the question, and the answer made him uncomfortable. "Too many times," he said finally. "Way too many times." The conversation continued as they drove through neighborhoods they had patrolled for years, past houses where they had responded to calls, streets where they had made arrests, corners where they had conducted stops. Each familiar landmark now carried new meaning, viewed through the lens of their encounter with Jerome Washington. "Do you remember that call last month?" Kyle said, "about the suspicious person in Riverside Gardens?" Brad nodded grimly. Young black kid walking through an upscale neighborhood. They had stopped him, questioned him, made him prove that he belonged there. The kid had been polite, respectful, had shown them his school identification and explained that he was walking home from basketball practice. They had let him go with a warning about being more aware of how his presence might concern residents. At the time, it had seemed like good community policing, being responsive to resident concerns while treating the young man fairly. Now, in the aftermath of their confrontation with Jerome Washington, the interaction took on a different cast. "That kid probably felt exactly like Chief Washington felt tonight," Kyle said, "like he had to justify his existence to us." Brad pulled the patrol car into a parking space outside a 24-hour diner, the kind of place where cops gathered during quiet moments of their shifts. But instead of going inside for coffee and conversation with other officers, Both men sat in the car, processing the implications of their evening. "We need to talk about this," Brad said. "Really talk about it, not just pretend it didn't happen." Kyle nodded. "That recording he made is going to be played for other officers. They're going to hear us questioning his identification, making assumptions about his right to be in that neighborhood, treating him like a criminal for unlocking his own front door." The thought was mortifying. Police culture placed enormous emphasis on respect among colleagues, on not being seen as incompetent or biased. Having their mistakes preserved for training purposes meant that their poor judgment would become a teaching tool for years to come. But gradually, both officers began to see a different perspective on that preservation. "Maybe that's good," Brad said slowly. "Maybe other officers need to hear how easy it is to let assumptions take over, how quickly a routine call can become harassment." Kyle looked at him with surprise. "You're not embarrassed about being used as a bad example?" Brad was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Of course I'm embarrassed," he said finally. "But I'm more concerned about making sure this doesn't happen again, to us or to anybody else." The transformation was subtle but significant. Both officers were moving from self-protection to genuine accountability, from concern about their own reputations to commitment to systemic improvement. "What did you think of him?" Kyle asked. "Chief Washington, I mean. How he handled the situation." Brad thought carefully before responding. "He could have destroyed us," he said. "Could have called for immediate backup, had us arrested for harassment, made a huge public scene about racist cops abusing their authority. Instead, he turned it into a teaching moment." "That takes a special kind of leadership," Kyle agreed. "Most people in his position would have gone for our throats. Instead, he's giving us a chance to learn and grow." Both men were beginning to understand that they had encountered something rare, a leader who prioritized education over punishment, growth over retribution, systemic change over individual consequences. The radio crackled with their call sign. "Unit 1247, report to headquarters for end-of-shift debriefing with Commander Phillips." The summons wasn't unexpected. Word of their encounter with the new chief had clearly reached their immediate supervisor, and they would need to provide a full account of the evening's events. As they drove toward headquarters, both officers wrestled with how to frame their report, how to be honest about their mistakes without minimizing the learning opportunity that Jerome Washington had provided. Commander Phillips was waiting for them in his office, a small space made smaller by filing cabinets, commendation plaques, and the accumulated paperwork of police administration. Phillips was a 25-year veteran who had worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect for his fairness and his commitment to developing younger officers. "Sit down," Phillips said, gesturing toward two chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Tell me what happened tonight." Brad and Kyle exchanged a glance, both understanding that this conversation would be crucial to their future careers. They needed to be honest about their mistakes while demonstrating that they had learned from the experience. "Commander," Brad began, "we responded to a call about suspicious activity and made some serious errors in judgment." Over the next 20 minutes, both officers provided a detailed account of their interaction with Jerome Washington. They described their initial assumptions, their questioning of his identification, their escalation of the situation, and ultimately their recognition of who they were confronting. Commander Phillips listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more serious as the story progressed. When they finished, Phillips leaned back in his chair and studied both men for a long moment. "Officers," he said finally, "you've just described a textbook example of how implicit bias can turn routine police work into community harassment. You're lucky Chief Washington handled this with such professionalism, because this could have been a career-ending incident for both of you." Brad and Kyle nodded, understanding the gravity of Phillips's assessment. "However," Phillips continued, "I'm impressed by your honesty in describing what happened, and by your apparent recognition of the problems with your approach. Chief Washington called me personally to discuss how to handle this situation, and he's recommended that we use this as a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter." Relief flooded both men's faces, but Phillips wasn't finished. That said, he continued, you'll both be participating in additional training over the next several weeks. Community relations, implicit bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and you'll be working directly with Chief Washington to develop training materials based on tonight's incident. The assignment was both opportunity and challenge. Working with Jerome Washington would give them the chance to learn directly from someone who had experienced policing from both sides, but it would also serve as a constant reminder of their misjudgment. "Commander," Kyle said, "may I ask what Chief Washington is like to work with?" Phillips smiled for the first time during the conversation. "Officer Morrison, you're about to find out, but I can tell you this. He's the kind of leader who makes everyone around him better if they're willing to listen and learn." As they left Phillips's office, both officers felt a mixture of emotions: relief at avoiding immediate punishment, embarrassment at their mistakes, but also something approaching excitement about the opportunity to work with their new chief. The patrol car ride back to their respective homes was quieter than their earlier conversation, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence of shame and regret, but the contemplative quiet of officers beginning to envision a different way of approaching their work. Brad dropped Kyle off at the precinct parking lot where his personal car was parked, and both men paused before parting ways. "Kyle," Brad said through the open car window, "tomorrow I'm going to start reading about implicit bias, about community policing, about ways to build trust instead of tearing it down." Kyle nodded. "Me too. And I'm going to call my nephew, the one who goes to college in this district. I want to ask him what it's like being a young black man in encounters with police." Both men understood that their education was just beginning, that tonight's incident was not an ending but a starting point for deeper learning and personal growth. As they drove home to their families, their neighborhoods, their lives outside of police work, both Brad Kingston and Kyle Morrison carried with them the seeds of transformation. They had encountered a leader who had shown them a different way of approaching law enforcement, a way that prioritized dignity over dominance, understanding over authority, community building over community control. Monday morning would bring their first official meeting with Chief Jerome Washington, their first glimpse of how his leadership would reshape the department they had served for years. But the real change had already begun tonight, on a suburban porch, in a conversation that turned confrontation into education and mistakes into opportunities for growth. Sunday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Detroit. The kind of weather that drew families onto front porches and children onto sidewalks for last moments of outdoor play before school week routines resumed. Jerome Washington sat on his porch swing, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he watched his son Clarence practice basketball shots in the driveway. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and conversations that would reshape his approach to Monday morning's first day as chief of police. Word of Friday night's incident had spread through official channels, community networks, and the informal communication systems that connected every aspect of Detroit's social fabric. Mayor Stephen Bradley had called Saturday morning, expressing both concern about the incident and admiration for how Jerome had handled it. The mayor understood that police chiefs lived in a fishbowl, where every action was scrutinized, analyzed, and interpreted as indicative of larger leadership philosophies. "Stephen," Jerome had said during their phone conversation, "this incident is exactly why we need comprehensive reform. It's not enough to punish officers for bias after the fact. We need to prevent bias from affecting their judgment in the first place." The mayor had agreed to support expanded training programs, community engagement initiatives, and policy changes that would make the Detroit Police Department a model for other cities struggling with similar issues. But perhaps more significantly, word of the incident had reached community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens who had been watching Jerome's appointment with mixture of hope and skepticism. A police chief who understood firsthand what it felt like to be profiled by officers carried credibility that no amount of policy papers or press conferences could provide. Pastor Isaiah Coleman from Mount Calvary Baptist Church had stopped by Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to welcome Jerome to the neighborhood, but actually to discuss the incident and its implications for police-community relations. "Chief Washington," Pastor Coleman had said, settling into the porch chair that Jerome offered, "I've been praying for 20 years that we'd get a police chief who truly understood our community's concerns. Friday night proved that you don't just understand them intellectually, you've lived them personally." The conversation had stretched through the afternoon, covering everything from department hiring practices to community oversight mechanisms to the role of faith communities in bridging divides between law enforcement and neighborhoods. What impressed Pastor Coleman most wasn't that Jerome had been harassed by officers, but how he had responded to that harassment with grace, wisdom, and a commitment to education over retribution. "That's the kind of leadership we need," Pastor Coleman had said as he prepared to leave. "Not someone who uses power to settle scores, but someone who uses authority to create opportunities for growth and understanding." Similar conversations had taken place throughout the weekend. Community activists who had initially viewed Jerome's appointment with suspicion now spoke of cautious optimism. Neighborhood leaders who had demanded civilian oversight of police operations now talked about partnerships and collaboration. But the most meaningful conversation had taken place Saturday night around the Washington family dinner table. "Daddy," 11-year-old Shanice had asked, "why were those police officers mean to you?" The question had opened a family discussion that Jerome and Ebony had been dreading but knew was necessary. How do you explain racial profiling to children? How do you help them understand that some people might treat them differently because of the color of their skin without making them fearful or cynical? "Sweetheart," Jerome had said carefully, "sometimes people make assumptions about others based on how they look rather than who they really are. Those officers made assumptions about me that weren't true." "But you're a police officer too," 8-year-old Clarence had said. "Don't police officers help each other?" "They should," Jerome had replied. "And most of the time they do. But sometimes people make mistakes, and when they do, we have to help them learn to do better." Ebony had watched the conversation with the keen attention of a parent and a professional healthcare worker. She understood that their children would face similar assumptions and challenges throughout their lives, and that how they learned to process and respond to those experiences would shape their worldview and their opportunities. The family discussion had continued through dessert, with questions about fairness, justice, the difference between individual prejudice and systemic discrimination, and the responsibility that came with positions of authority. Now, as Jerome sat on his porch Sunday evening, watching his son practice basketball and thinking about the enormity of the task that awaited him Monday morning, he felt the weight of representation in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He wasn't just responsible for leading a police department. He was carrying the hopes and expectations of communities that had been underserved, over-policed, and underprotected for generations. He was representing the possibility that law enforcement could change, could improve, could become the kind of institution that truly served and protected everyone equally. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Chief Washington, this is Officer Brad Kingston. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity you've given me and Officer Morrison to learn from our mistakes. I've spent the weekend reading about implicit bias and thinking about how to be a better police officer. I look forward to working with you tomorrow." The message was followed by another from Kyle Morrison. "Chief, I called my nephew who attends Wayne State and asked him about his experiences with police. It was a difficult conversation, but an important one. Thank you for showing me that there's always room to grow and improve." Jerome smiled, feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibility of real change within the department. If two officers who had demonstrated clear bias could acknowledge their mistakes and commit to growth, perhaps the broader culture of the department could evolve as well. But he also understood that change would be neither quick nor easy. Police departments were institutions with deep-rooted cultures, informal hierarchies, and resistance to reform that often operated below the surface of official policies and procedures. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Detective Sergeant Janelle Rivers, one of the department's rising stars and someone Jerome had mentored during her transition from patrol to investigations. "Chief," Janelle said when he answered, "I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday evening, but I wanted to talk to you about the incident Friday night." Jerome settled deeper into the porch swing, recognizing that this conversation would likely be representative of many he would have with officers throughout the department. "What's on your mind, Janelle?" "Word about what happened has spread through the department," she said. "There are different reactions. Some officers are embarrassed that colleagues treated their new chief so badly. Others are worried about what this means for how you'll view and lead the rank and file." Jerome had expected this response. Police officers, like members of any organization, were concerned about how their new leader's personal experiences would affect his management style and policy decisions. "Janelle," Jerome said, "I need you and every other officer to understand something. Friday night's incident doesn't change my commitment to supporting good officers who do their jobs professionally and effectively. But it did reinforce my determination to address the cultural issues that allow bias to affect police work." "What does that look like practically?" she asked. "It looks like training that goes beyond legal requirements to address real-world scenarios," Jerome explained. "It looks like community engagement that builds relationships rather than just managing problems. It looks like accountability systems that catch problems early rather than waiting for crises." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most importantly, it looks like leadership that demonstrates the values we want to see throughout the department. Officers need to see that fairness, respect, and dignity aren't just words in a mission statement. They're principles that guide every decision and every interaction." Janelle was quiet for a moment, processing his response. "Chief, can I ask how you're handling this personally? It must have been difficult being treated that way by fellow officers." Jerome looked out at his neighborhood, at the houses where families were settling into Sunday evening routines, at the streetlights beginning to flicker on as daylight faded. "It was difficult," he said honestly, "but it was also instructive. It reminded me why this job matters, why reform is necessary, and why we can't accept that's how things have always been done as an excuse for treating community members with anything less than full respect and dignity." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from departmental morale to community expectations to the practical challenges of implementing change in a large, complex organization. When the call ended, Jerome remained on the porch, watching as his son finished basketball practice and headed inside to complete homework. The ordinary rhythm of family life continued, providing stability and grounding in the midst of professional challenges that would test his leadership abilities and personal resilience. Ebony joined him on the porch swing, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee and settling beside him with the comfortable familiarity of a couple who had navigated challenges together for 15 years. "Ready for tomorrow?" she asked. "As ready as I can be," Jerome replied. The incident Friday night was a preview of the kind of resistance and challenge I'll face as chief, but it was also a reminder of why this work matters. Ebony took his hand, providing the kind of quiet support that had sustained him throughout his career. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new tests of his leadership abilities and his commitment to reform. But tonight, sitting on his porch with his wife beside him and his children safe inside, Jerome Washington felt prepared for the work ahead. Friday night's confrontation had been painful, embarrassing, and revealing. It had also been transformative, educational, and ultimately empowering. Monday morning would mark the beginning of his tenure as chief of police. But his real leadership had already begun Friday night on this same porch, in a conversation that turned harassment into education and bias into opportunity for growth. Monday morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of autumn air that carried promises of change and the faint scent of leaves beginning their transformation. Jerome Washington stood in his bedroom, adjusting the chief's insignia on his uniform for the first time, feeling the weight of new responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a familiar but heavier jacket. Ebony watched from the bed, coffee in hand, her expression mixing pride with concern. "You look like a chief," she said with a smile that didn't quite hide her worry about the challenges that awaited him. "Feel like one too," Jerome replied, though they both understood that the real test of his leadership would come not from wearing the uniform, but from earning the respect and trust of officers who might view him with suspicion, skepticism, or outright hostility. Downstairs, Clarence and Shanice were finishing breakfast, their school backpacks packed and waiting by the door. The ordinary routine of family life provided grounding and perspective that Jerome would need as he navigated the complex politics of police administration. "Dad," Shanice said as he joined them at the kitchen table, "are you nervous about your first day?" "A little," Jerome admitted. "Starting any new job is challenging, and being a police chief means making decisions that affect a lot of people." "But you're going to make things better, right?" Clarence asked with the directness that only children could bring to complex issues. "I'm going to try my best," Jerome said, which was both honest and appropriately modest for the magnitude of the task ahead. The drive to police headquarters took Jerome through neighborhoods he had patrolled as a young officer, past corners where he had made arrests, through districts where he had built relationships with community leaders, business owners, and residents who had watched his career progression with interest and hope. Detroit's police headquarters was a modern building that contrasted sharply with the older precincts scattered throughout the city. The architecture was intended to convey professionalism and transparency, with large windows, open spaces, and design elements that suggested accessibility and community engagement. Jerome parked in the space designated for the chief of police, a small but symbolic gesture that marked his transition from subordinate to leader. The nameplate on the parking space had been changed over the weekend. Chief Jerome Washington, Detroit Police Department. Inside the building, the morning shift was beginning with the familiar rhythm of law enforcement operations. Officers checking equipment, reviewing overnight reports, receiving briefings about priority calls and ongoing investigations. The background noise was constant: radio chatter, telephone conversations, computer keyboards, and the low hum of people preparing for another day of police work. But this morning was different. Word of the new chief's first day had spread throughout the department, and Jerome could feel the weight of attention, evaluation, and judgment as he walked through corridors lined with offices, briefing rooms, and the accumulated history of decades of police operations. His first stop was the office that would serve as his headquarters for the foreseeable future. The chief's office was larger than any space Jerome had occupied during his career, with windows overlooking the city, walls lined with commendations and photographs from previous chiefs, and furniture that suggested authority and permanence. But the office also felt impersonal, like a space waiting to be claimed and shaped by its new occupant. Jerome spent a few minutes arranging personal items: family photographs, his framed copy of the police officer's creed, books on leadership and community policing that had influenced his thinking throughout his career. A knock on the door interrupted his settling-in process. "Come in," he called, and Deputy Chief Amanda Foster entered, carrying a stack of briefing materials and wearing the expression of someone prepared to provide crucial information and support. "Good morning, Chief," she said with professional warmth. "Welcome to your first day. I've prepared briefings on current operations, ongoing investigations, budget issues, and personnel matters that require immediate attention." Amanda Foster had been passed over for the chief's position, a fact that made her support particularly valuable and potentially complicated. She was widely respected within the department, had strong relationships with community leaders, and possessed institutional knowledge that would be crucial for Jerome's success. But she was also someone who might have expected to lead the department herself, and Jerome understood that their working relationship would require careful navigation of professional respect, personal ambition, and organizational dynamics. "Amanda," Jerome said, settling behind his desk, "I want you to know that I value your experience and expertise, and I hope we can work together as partners. I know you've given years to this department, and I don't intend to sideline that wisdom." Amanda studied him carefully. the kind of measured look that came from decades of sizing up new bosses. Her hands rested lightly on the stack of folders. "I'll be honest, Chief," she said, her tone professional but edged with candor. "Some people in this building expected me to be sitting where you are now. I can't pretend that disappointment doesn't exist, but I also can't ignore the fact that you've been chosen, and that means we succeed or fail together." Jerome nodded, appreciating the honesty. "I can work with that. What I ask from you, and from every officer here, is transparency. If you disagree with me, say so. If you see something I'm missing, tell me. We won't always align, but we'll always be accountable." Amanda placed the folders on his desk. "Then let's start with the reality. The rank and file are skeptical. Some of them see you as a reformer who will hang them out to dry. Others think you're a career politician wearing a badge. And the union? They're already sharpening their knives." Her words weren't a warning. They were a map of the battlefield ahead. Jerome leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the office and the challenge pressing in at once. "Then we'd better be ready," he said quietly. That was the moment he knew his first day wasn't about introductions or handshakes. It was about preparing for a storm. The storm arrived sooner than Jerome expected. By mid-morning, word had already leaked through back channels about Friday night's confrontation on Maple Grove Drive. Not the whole story, not the truth about 2 patrol officers nearly cuffing their new chief, but enough fragments to set rumors churning through the halls of headquarters. Some officers whispered that Jerome had pulled rank unfairly. Others claimed he had staged the incident to push his reform agenda. Still others, the old guard with decades on the force, muttered about a cop who thinks he's more politician than officer. Deputy Chief Amanda Foster slid a thick file across his desk before their next briefing. "These are the union talking points," she said. "Leaked to me an hour ago. They'll hit the press by afternoon." Jerome flipped the file open. In bold letters, the document accused him of being soft on discipline, hostile to rank-and-file morale, and more concerned with community optics than officer safety. One bullet point cited his career-long record of filing complaints against colleagues, twisting accountability into betrayal. Another painted his porch incident as a stunt, an exaggerated neighborhood misunderstanding blown up to make police look racist. Jerome felt his jaw tighten. He had lived his whole career under scrutiny, but seeing the truth weaponized so brazenly was a new kind of attack. "They're circling the wagons," Amanda said. Her voice carried no judgment, only pragmatism. "And the first meeting with the police union is this afternoon. If you don't control the narrative in that room, they will." The conference room on the second floor of headquarters smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale paper. Around the table sat 15 men and women in uniform and plain clothes, the leadership of the Detroit Police Officers Association. At the head sat Union President Frank Donnelly, a barrel-chested veteran with 30 years on the force and a reputation for protecting his members with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. "Chief Washington," Donnelly began, his voice measured but edged with hostility. "Welcome to your first meeting. Let's get straight to it. Morale is at rock bottom. Officers feel attacked, second-guessed, and hung out to dry. And then we hear about some incident at your house that you're supposedly turning into a training seminar. What exactly are we dealing with here?" Jerome kept his tone even. "You're dealing with a chief who expects professionalism." 2 officers responded to a vague call. They made assumptions. I corrected them. No arrests, no charges, no disciplinary records. But yes, I intend to use it as a teaching example. Because if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone in this city. Murmurs rippled around the table. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Donnelly leaned forward. "With respect, Chief, our job is dangerous enough without armchair lectures. We're asked to make snap judgments in life-or-death situations. Now you're telling us we'll be hauled into training every time someone doesn't like how we look at them." Jerome locked eyes with him. "No, I'm telling you we'll be trained to recognize when our judgments are clouded by bias. That's not punishment. That's survival. It keeps officers safe. It keeps civilians safe. It keeps this department credible. Silence stretched. The weight of his words hung heavy, clashing with the defensive postures around the table. Finally, Amanda Foster, seated at Jerome's side, broke in. "Let's not pretend this is about one porch incident. This is about a department deciding whether it wants to evolve or stay trapped in patterns that are tearing cities apart nationwide. Chief Washington has the mayor's backing. He has the council's backing. The question is, do you?" Donnelly's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. The meeting ended without consensus, but Jerome left with the sense that he had drawn a line. By evening, Detroit's local news stations were ablaze with coverage. "Newly appointed police chief in confrontation with his own officers," the headlines read. One broadcast showed a blurry cell phone clip. Ebony's partial recording from the porch had somehow reached reporters. The footage captured the flashing lights, the raised voices, and Jerome's calm declaration, "You are about to arrest your new boss." The clip went viral. Civil rights activists hailed Jerome as a symbol of resilience. Talk radio hosts mocked him as a cop-turned-victim. The mayor's office scrambled to manage the narrative, while Jerome's phone buzzed with messages from pastors, community leaders, and fellow chiefs in other cities. That night, at the family dinner table, Shanice asked the question Jerome had been dreading. "Daddy, why are they saying you tricked the police?" Jerome exchanged a look with Ebony. "Because sometimes people don't want to admit when they're wrong," he said softly. "So they change the story. But the truth has a way of coming out." The pushback grew sharper inside headquarters. Some officers avoided eye contact in hallways. Others muttered openly about chief bias training. A note slipped anonymously under his office door read, "Step back or we'll make sure you do." Amanda found him standing at his window late one night, staring out at the city skyline. "They'll test you," she said quietly. "Every reformer gets tested. The question is, do you want to break them with punishment or bend them with persistence?" Jerome's answer was simple. "Neither. I want to change them." 2 days later, the real blow landed. A columnist for the Detroit Tribune published a front-page exposé. The complaints file, what the new chief doesn't want you to see. The article listed every past complaint against Jerome: excessive force, insubordination, attitude problems. Each had been dismissed, but the framing was clear. Detroit's new chief carried baggage. Jerome read the paper in silence, his face unreadable. He knew exactly what this was: a leak from inside the department. Someone had dug through his personnel file and fed selective information to the press. It wasn't just resistance, it was sabotage. He folded the paper carefully and set it on his desk. "Amanda," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Find out who did this, not for revenge, for accountability. If they'll leak my file, they'll leak anything." Amanda nodded grimly. "And Chief, brace yourself, the real storm's just beginning." The storm hit on a Wednesday evening, just as Detroit was starting to catch its breath from the porch incident headlines. Dispatch reported shots fired on the city's west side. A 21-year-old black man named DeAndre Lewis was stopped for a broken taillight. Within minutes, the encounter escalated into gunfire. By the time backup arrived, DeAndre lay bleeding beside his car, and Officer Raymond Cafferty, a 12-year veteran with a history of complaints, stood over him, weapon still drawn. The body cam footage was grim. DeAndre had been unarmed. His hands were raised. His last words were caught clearly on tape. "Why you doing this? I ain't got nothing." By dawn, the city was on fire. Protesters crowded outside precinct houses, chanting DeAndre's name. Social media replayed the body cam clip on loop. Civil rights attorneys demanded federal intervention, and every headline framed the same question: would Chief Jerome Washington handle this case differently than his predecessors? Mayor Stephen Bradley called an emergency meeting at City Hall. The atmosphere was suffocating. Cameras outside, reporters swarming, activists chanting on the steps. Inside, around a polished mahogany table, the city's power brokers leaned in like vultures. The mayor's tone was sharp. "Chief Washington, you have a crisis on your hands. The community demands accountability. The union is already circling wagons around Officer Cafferty. The council wants answers before the evening news cycle. What's your move? Jerome spoke carefully. We suspend Cafferty immediately pending investigation. We release the body cam footage publicly. Transparency is the only way forward. Union President Frank Donnelly slammed his fist on the table. Over my dead body! That officer feared for his life. Suspend him without due process and you'll destroy every ounce of morale we have left. Council President Rebecca Martinez countered immediately. And if you don't suspend him, you'll have riots in the streets. This city has no patience left for excuses. The room erupted in overlapping demands. Jerome sat silently, listening. He thought of DeAndre Lewis's mother, who by now had probably seen the footage. He thought of his own children, asleep in their beds just blocks away from where DeAndre had fallen. He thought of Friday night on his porch, when he himself had been seconds away from being treated like a suspect in his own home. When the room finally quieted, Jerome spoke with measured finality. This department will not protect misconduct. Officer Cafferty is suspended, full investigation, and the footage goes public tonight. The mayor studied him, calculating the political fallout. Then, slowly, he nodded. Back at headquarters, Jerome's decision landed like a grenade. Some officers applauded his stance. Others muttered openly that he had sold out one of his own. An anonymous post on an internal message board read, "Chief Washington wants us dead in the streets. Next time, don't hesitate. Shoot first or you'll be the one suspended." Jerome walked the halls with Amanda Foster at his side, hearing the whispers, feeling the stares. "They think you're sacrificing Cafferty to make a point," Amanda said quietly. "I'm not sacrificing him," Jerome replied. "I'm upholding the law. There's a difference." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Perception mattered as much as principle, and perception was slipping through his fingers. In a twist of irony, it was Officers Brad Kingston and Kyle Morrison, the very men who had confronted Jerome on his porch, who became central to the investigation. They had been first responders to the aftermath of the shooting, arriving just minutes after Cafferty fired. Their body cams captured raw footage, DeAndre bleeding out, Cafferty pacing, muttering about not having a choice. Summoned to headquarters, Brad and Kyle sat across from Jerome in a closed-door meeting. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Jerome said. Brad's voice was low but steady. "Chief, we saw a young man down, hands empty. We saw Cafferty shaken, like he knew what he'd done was wrong. We secured the scene, but there was no weapon. Nothing." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "We've backed Cafferty before, but this wasn't clean, sir." Jerome studied them. Just weeks ago, these men had nearly cuffed him on his own porch. Now they were offering testimony that could decide the fate of an officer and the future of the department. "You understand the weight of this," Jerome said. "Yes, sir," Brad replied. "But if you want us to be better cops, it starts with telling the truth, even when it hurts." For the first time, Jerome felt a flicker of pride. Maybe his message was getting through. The following morning, Jerome called a department-wide briefing. Hundreds of officers packed into the auditorium, the air thick with tension. Some arms were crossed in defiance, others rested on knees in weary resignation. Jerome stepped to the podium. He didn't use notes. He didn't need them. "I know many of you are angry. I know you feel betrayed. But let me ask you, what are we if we protect wrongdoing? What are we if the people we swore to protect can't trust us? We wear this badge not for ourselves, but for them. And every time one of us abuses it, we all pay the price." He paused, scanning the room. Some eyes avoided his gaze. Others met it, hard and defiant. "Friday night, 2 of our own nearly arrested me in front of my family. Why? Because I didn't look like I belonged. If that can happen to your chief, imagine what happens to the ordinary citizens we serve. This isn't about politics. This is about survival, for our community and for this department." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Slowly, a few officers began to nod. Change was coming. whether they welcomed it or not. That evening, as Jerome prepared to leave headquarters, Amanda intercepted him with a grim expression. She handed him a plain white envelope left at the front desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper with block letters cut from a magazine. "Step back or you won't make it to Christmas." Jerome folded the note carefully, his face unreadable. "Make sure the mayor sees this," he told Amanda, "and tell the family protection detail to stay on my house until further notice." For the first time, the battle for reform wasn't just about policies or public perception. It was about survival. The threat note changed everything. Jerome had lived through danger before: undercover busts, violent raids, suspects with nothing to lose. But this was different. This was internal. This was coming from within the very institution he was sworn to lead. It was no longer just about reform. It was about rooting out rot that had burrowed deep into the bones of the department. Ebony noticed the difference immediately. That night, as they locked the doors and checked on the children, she found Jerome staring out the bedroom window, shoulders rigid. "You've carried danger before," she said softly, "but this is heavier." Jerome didn't turn. "Because this time, it's not the streets I'm fighting. It's my own house." Amanda Foster worked quietly but efficiently. By Friday, she had traced the Tribune leak back to Sergeant Paul Riker, a mid-level officer with close ties to Union President Donnelly. Riker had accessed Jerome's personnel file without authorization and funneled selected complaints to the press. Amanda delivered the report with clipped precision. "We can nail him on breach of confidentiality. But if you move too hard, the Union will cry witch hunt. Move too soft, and you look weak." Jerome studied the file. "We move fair, suspend him with cause, due process, and then we show every officer in this department that rules apply across the board." The suspension sent shockwaves. Some officers called it tyranny. Others, quietly, whispered that maybe, just maybe, the new chief was serious about accountability. The personal cost escalated next. One evening, Ebony returned from a late hospital shift to find their mailbox smashed, their car tires slashed. Clarence's basketball hoop was bent nearly to the ground. On the garage door, in black spray paint, 3 words: "Traitor to Blue." Jerome's stomach turned cold. His children stared wide-eyed as neighbors gathered. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was intimidation aimed at breaking him through his family. He ordered a round-the-clock protection detail. But he also sat his children down at the dinner table. "This is what happens when people are afraid of change," he told them. "But fear doesn't win. We do." Shanice, barely 11, looked him square in the eye. "Then don't quit, Daddy. Make them better." Her words hardened his resolve. If the threats were meant to isolate Jerome, they had the opposite effect. The community rallied. Pastors organized vigils outside police headquarters. Activists held press conferences demanding protection for the chief. Neighborhood leaders who once doubted his commitment now spoke of his courage. For the first time, Jerome felt genuine momentum. The people of Detroit weren't just watching. They were standing with him. On Sunday, the steps of City Hall overflowed with supporters holding candles and signs. "Stand with the chief. Justice needs courage. We belong everywhere." Ebony stood beside him, holding Shanice and Clarence close as Jerome addressed the crowd. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about every citizen who's been told they don't belong. We will build a department that protects everyone equally, no exceptions." The cheers rolled across downtown like thunder. Monday morning brought a moment Jerome hadn't expected. In the packed briefing room, officers Brad Kingston and Kyle Morrison, the same men who had once tried to block him on his own porch, stepped forward voluntarily. Brad cleared his throat. "Chief Washington, I want to say something." His voice shook, but he pushed on. "We were wrong that night. Wrong in how we treated you. Wrong in how we treated citizens before. You gave us a chance to learn, and I want every officer here to know he's not tearing us down. He's making us better." The room fell into stunned silence. Kyle stepped up beside him. "We didn't want to see it before. But he's right. Bias makes us sloppy. It makes us dangerous. If it can happen on his porch, it can happen on yours. We owe it to this city and ourselves to change." For the first time, Jerome saw heads nodding, not in reluctant acknowledgement but in genuine agreement. The tide was turning. That afternoon, Jerome convened every command officer in the department. Captains, lieutenants, sergeants. The room brimmed with skepticism, but also curiosity. He stood at the front, uniform crisp, voice steady. "Some of you think I'm here to punish. I'm not. I'm here to lead. Some of you think I'm here to shame. I'm not. I'm here to build. But building requires tearing down what's rotten. If you're part of the rot, you'll resist me. If you're part of the future, you'll walk with me." He paused, letting the words settle. "You've seen me tested. You've seen my family threatened. You've seen officers suspended for breaking rules. But you've also seen what happens when we stand together. The community rallies. Trust grows. And every one of us walks safer streets." His voice sharpened. "So decide. Are you with the old way, the way of silence, bias, and cover-ups? Or are you with me, building something better? Because there is no middle ground." The silence afterward wasn't hostile this time. It was thoughtful. It was heavy. It was change beginning to crack the wall. Weeks later, at his first citywide press conference as chief, Jerome stood with Mayor Bradley, Council President Martinez, and, most strikingly, officers Kingston and Morrison flanking him. The image made front pages. A black chief once harassed on his porch, now backed by two white officers who had become his unlikely allies. Jerome spoke plainly. Reform doesn't start with policies. It starts with people. It starts with admitting when we're wrong and choosing to do better. Detroit will not be perfect, but Detroit will be honest, and that's the beginning of trust. The applause wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was steady, sustained, and real. One quiet evening, weeks after the storm, Jerome sat again on his porch. The brass nameplate glinted in the lamplight. The wind chimes swayed softly. Shanice and Clarence played in the yard. Ebony leaned against him, warm and steady. He thought of that night when flashing lights and suspicion had turned his home into a battlefield. He thought of the union showdowns, the media firestorm, the threats painted on his garage. He thought of Brad and Kyle, of their transformation from adversaries to allies. And he thought of the words he had spoken to the department. Every interaction builds trust or destroys it. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about speeches or titles. It was about moments like these. Small, human, fragile, where dignity triumphed over fear, and justice took root on an ordinary porch in Detroit. Jerome Washington leaned back, listening to the laughter of his children, the city humming in the distance. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time he believed they were moving forward, and that was enough.